They threw her out with nothing but the tattered clothes on her back, the icy wind slicing through her like 1,000 knives. Elena stumbled through the snow, her legs sinking into the frozen earth as the bitter gusts lashed against her face. Her hair, once golden and thick, now hung in tangled clumps around her hollow eyes. The settlement had turned their backs on her, shoving her into the unforgiving cold with no food, no shelter, and no mercy. They whispered that she was cursed, that her presence brought death and misfortune. But Elena had only been a widow, a woman whose husband died in a hunting accident, leaving her alone and penniless. Now, as the snowflakes swirled around her like ghosts, she fought to keep her eyes open. Each breath was a ragged gasp, each step a painful lurch forward. Somewhere in the distance, the howling of wolves echoed through the trees, their cries a haunting reminder of how close she was to death. Elena fell to her knees, the cold seeping into her bones. The world around her blurred, fading into a white abyss. But as her vision dimmed, a shadow loomed above her, a man cloaked in furs, his dark eyes fierce and unyielding. He knelt beside her, his hands strong and warm against her frozen skin. "You're not going to die," he said, his voice a low, steady command. "Not tonight." With a swift, powerful movement, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he strode through the snow, each step purposeful, each breath a cloud of steam against the biting wind. His scent was of smoke and cedar, a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. As they moved deeper into the forest, Elena's mind drifted between consciousness and darkness. She clutched his fur cloak, fingers trembling as the bitter wind roared around them. In the distance, a faint light flickered, a campfire, a promise of life amid the deadly cold. The man held her closer, his jaw clenched against the freezing air. "Stay awake," he urged, his deep voice a lifeline in the storm. "Stay with me." And as Elena's eyes fluttered closed, the last thing she saw was his face. A stranger's face, but one that promised life against the cold. Elena's eyes fluttered open, the warmth of a crackling fire washing over her frozen skin. The scent of burning cedar filled the air, mingling with the sharp, earthy scent of the man who had saved her. He sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, his dark eyes fixed on the blade as if it held the secrets of the world. His face was stern, chiseled, a man accustomed to the wilderness. The flickering firelight danced over his high cheekbones and strong jawline. Elena tried to speak, but her throat was raw and aching. The man glanced at her, his gaze piercing yet calm. "Drink," he said, offering her a wooden bowl filled with steaming broth. "It will warm you." Elena's hands trembled as she took the bowl, the heat seeping through her fingers. She sipped cautiously, the hot liquid scalding her throat but awakening life inside her. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. The man's jaw tightened. "Because they left you to die," he said, his voice heavy with something unspoken. "And because no one should die alone in the snow." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the walls of the small makeshift shelter he had built, a sturdy lean-to of thick branches and furs. "What's your name?" Elena asked, her voice stronger now. The man's eyes flicked towards the fire. "Takoda," he said. "Cheyenne." Elena nodded, the name rolling off her tongue like a prayer. "Elena," she said. "They said I was cursed." Takoda's gaze hardened, his jaw clenching as he stared into the flames. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "But out here, fear can kill you faster than the cold." Elena swallowed, her heart pounding as she realized the truth. She was alive because of this man. And in the frozen wilderness, he was her only hope. Takoda moved silently through the snow, his fur-lined boots leaving barely a trace behind. Elena watched him from the shelter, her hands wrapped tightly around the now empty bowl. The fire crackled, its warmth a fragile barrier against the biting wind. Takoda's presence loomed like a shadow, a force of nature untamed and unyielding. He returned with a fresh stack of firewood, his breath misting in the air. "The storm's getting worse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We can't stay here much longer." Elena's heart sank, a heavy ache settling in her chest. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice laced with desperation. Takoda knelt by the fire, feeding it another log. "My people's camp is a day's walk north," he said, "but they won't welcome you easily." Elena's throat tightened. "Because I'm not one of them?" Takoda's dark eyes met hers, the firelight reflecting in their depths. "Because they've been betrayed before. Settlers came under the guise of friendship. Now they're buried beneath the snow." The words hung heavy between them, a cold truth cutting deeper than the wind. Elena's gaze fell to the ground, her fingers digging into the fur she sat upon. "I'm not like them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had nothing to do with what they did." Takoda's jaw clenched, his expression hardening. "Doesn't matter," he said. "To them, you're just another settler." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, whipping snow against the walls of the shelter. "You could leave me," Elena said, her voice hollow. "It would be easier." Takoda's eyes narrowed, his fists tightening. "I don't abandon people," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Not even those who don't belong." Elena's heart hammered in her chest, the realization sinking in. She was a stranger in this land, an outsider with no place, no people, and no future. Except for Takoda, a man bound by honor, even when the world had given him every reason to turn away. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of death and despair as Takoda led Elena through the snow-laden forest. Each step was a battle against the biting cold, the icy wind slicing through her threadbare cloak. Takoda moved ahead of her, his powerful stride steady and sure, a towering figure wrapped in furs and shadows. Elena's breath came in sharp, painful gasps, her legs trembling beneath her. "Keep moving," Takoda said without looking back. "If you stop, the cold will take you." Elena bit down on her chapped lip, forcing herself to keep pace. The world around them was a desolate sea of white, the trees skeletal and ominous, their branches creaking like old bones. Snowflakes clung to her hair, her lashes, her skin, each one a tiny, icy dagger. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice a ragged whisper. Takoda glanced over his shoulder, his jaw set. "A few hours, maybe more." Elena swallowed, her throat raw and parched. The fear gnawed at her, relentless and unyielding. If Takoda's people rejected her, where would she go? What would become of her? Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the air, a gunshot. Takoda froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. "Stay close," he ordered, his hand reaching for the knife strapped to his thigh. Elena's heart hammered in her chest, her breath fogging in the icy air. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Takoda's jaw clenched. "Hunters," he said, "or worse." Without another word, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her deeper into the forest. Branches snapped beneath their feet, the wind whipping through the trees like a haunting lullaby. The gunshot echoed again, closer this time. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears, fear prickling down her spine. "If they find us," Takoda said, his eyes fierce and dark, "you say nothing. You do nothing. You let me handle it." Elena nodded, her throat tight with terror. And as they pressed on, the snow falling heavier around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The snow fell heavier now, thick and blinding, as Takoda tightened his grip on Elena's wrist. They moved swiftly through the forest, their breaths mingling in the icy air like ghostly wisps. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat lurking in the shadows. The gunshots had ceased, but the danger was far from over. Takoda's jaw was set, his eyes scanning the trees with predatory focus. "They're close," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "Too close." Elena's heart pounded against her ribcage, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. Takoda's gaze darkened, his jaw clenching. "Raiders," he said, his tone grim. "Men who roam these woods, taking what they want and leaving nothing but blood behind." A shiver raced down Elena's spine, colder than the wind. "They'll kill us," she whispered. Takoda's grip tightened, his jaw set like stone. "Not if I kill them first." They pressed on, the snow crunching beneath their boots, each step echoing through the silent forest. Elena's legs ached, her skin raw from the biting wind. The memory of Takoda's campfire warmth seemed a distant dream now, lost in the endless expanse of white. Suddenly, Takoda halted, his body tense as a bowstring. Elena's breath caught as she followed his gaze. Ahead, through the falling snow, figures moved. 3 men draped in heavy furs, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes sharp and searching. "Stay behind me," Takoda whispered, releasing her wrist and drawing his knife. The blade gleamed, deadly and cold in the pale light. The men drew closer, their faces hard, eyes gleaming like wolves. "Well, well," one of them sneered, his gaze raking over Elena. "What do we have here? A stray and her dog?" Takoda stepped forward, his knife poised, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. "Leave," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. The men chuckled, their breath fogging in the air. "Or what?" the leader taunted, raising his rifle. Takoda's eyes blazed like embers in the snow. "Or I'll show you what it means to die screaming." The air was a breath away from shattering as Takoda lunged forward, his knife flashing in the pale, icy light. The leader barely had time to react before the blade sliced across his forearm, crimson blood splattering onto the snow. The man howled, dropping his rifle as his companions drew their weapons. Elena stumbled backward, her heart hammering like a trapped bird, eyes wide with terror. Takoda moved like a storm. Swift, brutal, relentless. He drove his fist into the jaw of the second man, the crack echoing through the trees like a gunshot. The third man raised his rifle, but Takoda was faster. He swung his knife in a vicious arc, the blade sinking into the man's shoulder. The gun clattered to the ground as the man screamed, clutching the wound. "Run, Elena!" Takoda roared, his voice a thunderclap in the storm. But Elena's legs refused to move. Fear had rooted her to the spot, her breaths ragged clouds of mist in the freezing air. The leader staggered to his feet, his eyes wild and bloodshot, face twisted in fury. He drew a knife of his own, the blade long and jagged. "You think you're tough?" he snarled, blood dripping from his arm. "Let's see how tough you are without that girl." He lunged at Elena, the knife flashing toward her throat. Time slowed, the world narrowing to the silver arc of the blade and the vicious snarl on the man's face. But before it could reach her, Takoda was there, his body colliding with the man's like a charging bear. They tumbled to the ground, fists flying, snow kicking up around them in a blinding spray. Elena watched in horror as Takoda grappled with the man, their bodies a blur of fists, blood, and fury. The other 2 men had fled, their screams echoing through the trees like dying wolves. The leader's knife slashed through the air, catching Takoda across the cheek. Blood trickled down his face, but his eyes burned with savage determination. With a roar, he drove his fist into the man's jaw, the impact sending a sickening crack through the forest. The man collapsed, eyes rolling back, blood pooling beneath his head. Takoda rose to his feet, his chest heaving, fists clenched. Blood dripped from his knuckles, staining the snow like crimson tears. Takoda stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving, blood smeared across his cheek and knuckles. The snow fell heavier now, thick and relentless, erasing the crimson stains beneath his feet. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the fallen raider, his eyes closed, jaw bruised and broken. The wind howled around them, a haunting wail that seemed to echo the violence still hanging in the air. Takoda wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, his dark eyes meeting Elena's. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough and low. Elena shook her head, though her knees trembled beneath her. I'm fine," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the man lying in the snow. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Takoda said, his jaw clenched tight. "Men like that don't stop unless someone makes them." Elena swallowed, her throat tight. "But you could have been killed." Takoda's eyes darkened, his fists still clenched at his sides. "I've survived worse," he said, his voice flat. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The wind roared, whipping through the trees like a banshee's wail. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, her voice small and fragile. Takoda glanced down at the unconscious man, his face hardening. "We leave him," he said, his tone cold. "If he wakes up, he'll crawl back to his kind. If he doesn't—" His words trailed off, but the meaning hung thick in the air. Elena shivered, the chill sinking deep into her bones. "Where will we go?" Takoda's gaze flicked to the north, where the trees thickened and the wind howled through the branches like a ghost's lament. "My people are close," he said, "but we have to keep moving. They don't trust outsiders." "And me?" Elena asked, her voice shaking. "Will they trust me?" Takoda's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing. "That depends," he said, his tone unreadable, "on whether you can prove you're not like the men who came before." Elena's heart clenched, the weight of his words pressing down like the falling snow. And as they turned away from the blood-soaked snow and back into the forest, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking toward something far more dangerous than the cold. The wind bit through Elena's clothes as they trudged deeper into the forest, each step a battle against the biting cold. The trees loomed taller now, their branches heavy with snow, the air thick with the scent of pine and smoke. Takoda moved ahead, his strides powerful and unyielding, eyes fixed forward. Elena's legs ached, her breath coming in sharp, icy bursts. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice strained. Takoda didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, a silent command for her to stop. Elena stilled, her heart pounding as she listened. The air was deathly silent, save for the muffled sound of voices drifting through the trees. Takoda's jaw clenched. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They moved forward, the trees parting to reveal a small clearing. Tents were scattered around a roaring fire, their skins weathered and patched. Men, women, and children huddled together, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow. The sight of them sent a chill down Elena's spine. These weren't just Takoda's people. They were survivors, outcasts, exiles. A man stepped forward, his face scarred, one eye clouded and milky white. He looked Takoda up and down, his expression hard. "You brought a settler here?" he said, his voice a low snarl. "After what they did to us?" Takoda's jaw tightened. She was left to die, he said, his voice steady. She's not one of them. The man's gaze flicked to Elena, his eyes burning with barely concealed rage. They took my son, he said, his fists clenched. Burned our homes, and now you bring one of them here? Elena swallowed, her throat tight. I didn't do those things, she said, her voice shaking. I lost my husband. They cast me out. I have nothing. The man's eyes narrowed, his jaw grinding. Nothing, he echoed, his voice dripping with contempt. You still have your life. Takoda stepped forward, his body tense. Enough, Chaza, he said. She's under my protection. Chaza sneered, his one good eye blazing. Your protection won't mean much when the others find out you brought a snake into our den. The crowd murmured, their voices a sea of suspicion and fear. Elena's heart pounded as she met Takoda's gaze. And in that moment, she knew. Her fight for survival was just beginning. The campfire crackled, the flames licking the night air as shadows danced across the faces of the gathered tribe. Eyes bore into Elena, suspicion hard and cold like the frost that clung to the ground. Takoda stood beside her, arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw set like stone. Chaza paced before them, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. You say she's innocent, he said, his voice loud, echoing through the clearing. But why should we believe you, Takoda? How do we know she's not a spy? A settler sent to lead them back to us? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, anger simmering beneath the surface. Elena swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Takoda's eyes never left Chaza, his gaze fierce and unyielding. She was left to die, he said, his voice firm. Cast out by her own people, she's not a threat. Chaza snorted, his one good eye gleaming with disdain. Or maybe she's just good at playing the victim, he said, stepping closer to Elena. We've all lost something because of settlers. My son, our land, our dignity. And now you want us to trust one of them? Elena trembled beneath Chaza's glare, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I'm not here to hurt anyone, she said, her voice shaking. I don't want anything but a chance to survive. Chaza's lips curled into a cruel smile. Then prove it, he said. If you want to stay here, you must pass the trial. The crowd murmured louder now, some nodding in agreement. Takoda's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. Chaza, he said, his voice low, dangerous. Enough. But Chaza ignored him, his gaze locked onto Elena. Tomorrow, at first light, he said, voice booming. You will walk through the frozen woods alone and bring back a token from the Black Cliff. If you return empty-handed, you're nothing but a liar and a thief. If you don't return at all, well, then we know what you truly are. Elena's blood ran cold, fear coiling like a snake in her gut. The Black Cliff. She had heard Takoda speak of it in hushed tones, a place where the wind howled like lost souls and the cliffs dropped into darkness. As Chaza stepped back, his face twisted into a grin, Elena's eyes met Takoda's. And in that moment, she knew. Her fight to survive had just taken a deadly turn. The wind howled like a wounded beast as Elena trudged through the snow, her breath coming in ragged, icy clouds. The Black Cliff loomed ahead, its jagged rocks rising like dark fangs against the gray sky. The air was colder here, biting through her thin cloak and chilling her to the bone. Each step was a struggle, her legs shaking, her muscles burning. Behind her the forest stretched endlessly, the camp hidden somewhere far beyond the trees. Elena's fingers trembled as she clutched the small hunting knife Takoda had pressed into her hand before she left. Trust yourself, he had whispered, his eyes dark and solemn. You're stronger than you think. But as she stood before the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping through her hair, she felt anything but strong. Below, the drop plunged into darkness, the ground lost in a swirling sea of mist. Elena's heart pounded as she scanned the cliffside, searching for the token Chaza demanded, a shard of black stone that only grew in the deepest crevices. Her gaze landed on a narrow ledge, a sliver of rock barely wide enough to stand on. The stone she needed glittered in the dim light, wedged between two crags just beyond reach. Gritting her teeth, Elena dropped to her knees, her fingers clawing at the icy ground as she inched closer to the edge. The wind screamed around her, tearing at her cloak, threatening to rip her from the cliffside and send her tumbling into oblivion. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cold, her heart hammering in her chest. Inch by inch, she stretched her arm, her fingertips grazing the shard. Almost there. The ground beneath her gave way. Elena screamed as her body slipped, her legs dangling over the abyss. Her fingers clawed desperately at the stone, nails scraping against the rock. The wind roared, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hang in the balance. But then, her hand closed around the shard, yanking it free as her other hand found a hold. With a guttural cry, she pulled herself up, her body collapsing onto solid ground, chest heaving, tears stinging her eyes. The shard of black stone glistened in her palm, its surface as cold as the death she had just escaped. And as Elena rose to her feet, the wind howling behind her, she knew she had passed the test. But what awaited her back at camp could be far deadlier than the black cliff.